Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her civilian clothes one last time before boarding Flight 447 from Miami to Denver. After 15 years of military service, she still felt strange wearing regular jeans and a simple black sweater instead of her Navy uniform. The small carry-on bag beside her contained nothing that would reveal her true identity. No medals, no military ID, just the clothes and books of what appeared to be an ordinary passenger. Sarah had earned her place among the most elite warriors in the world. As one of only 12 female Navy SEALs in active service, she had completed missions that most people would never hear about. Her specialty was aviation. She could pilot everything from small reconnaissance aircraft to massive transport planes. More importantly, she had been trained in combat situations that would break most people's minds. The flight to Denver was supposed to be routine. Sarah planned to spend 2 weeks visiting her sister's family, playing with her nephews, and trying to remember what normal life felt like. She had just returned from a classified mission in Eastern Europe that had kept her away from home for 8 months. The military doctors said she needed rest, but Sarah wasn't sure she remembered how to relax. As she walked down the airplane aisle, Sarah automatically scanned her environment. Old habits die hard. She noticed the emergency exits, counted the number of passengers, and identified potential threats without even thinking about it. Row 12, Seat A, window seat, just how she preferred it. She could see everything from there. The Boeing 737 was about half full, which was normal for a Tuesday afternoon flight. Sarah settled into her seat and pulled out a paperback novel, something light and easy to read. She had learned long ago that reading helped quiet the constant alertness that came with military training. Around her, other passengers were settling in. A businessman typing on his laptop, a mother trying to calm her crying baby, an elderly couple sharing a bag of crackers. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. She had been working for the airline for 12 years and thought she had seen everything. Jennifer noticed the woman in 12A immediately, not because she looked dangerous, but because she carried herself differently than most passengers. There was something about the way she moved, the way her eyes took in everything around her, that suggested she was more than she appeared. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Jennifer asked politely. "Just water, thank you," Sarah replied with a smile. Her voice was calm and friendly, giving no hint of the steel underneath. As the plane prepared for departure, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to shift into vacation mode. She thought about her nephews, ages 6 and 8, who were probably bouncing off the walls with excitement about their aunt's visit. She had promised to take them fishing and maybe teach them some basic self-defense moves, nothing too advanced, just enough to build their confidence. The takeoff was smooth, and soon they were cruising at 35,000 feet. Sarah was actually starting to relax when she noticed the man in 8C getting up from his seat. Something about his movement caught her attention. He walked too purposefully, his eyes scanning the cabin in a way that reminded her of mission briefings. The man was medium height with dark hair and wore a business suit that looked expensive but didn't quite fit right. As he moved toward the front of the plane, Sarah saw him reach inside his jacket. Her training kicked in instantly. The relaxed vacation mindset disappeared, replaced by the sharp focus that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations. What happened next changed everything. The man in the business suit suddenly shouted commands in accented English, pulling out what appeared to be a weapon. "Everyone sit down now. This plane is under our control." 2 other men immediately stood up from different parts of the cabin. One was near the back of the plane, blocking the rear exit. The other was in the middle section, and he also appeared to be armed. The passengers started screaming and ducking down in their seats. Sarah's mind shifted into combat mode automatically. She assessed the situation with the cold efficiency that had made her one of the Navy's most valuable assets. 3 hostiles, at least 2 weapons visible, approximately 60 civilians including crew. The men were positioned to control the main areas of the cabin, but they had made several tactical mistakes that Sarah immediately recognized. "Nobody move, and nobody gets hurt," the leader shouted. "We are taking this plane to our destination. If you cooperate, you will live to see your families again." Jennifer and the other flight attendants tried to calm the passengers while also complying with the hijackers' demands. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, steady but strained. "Ladies and Gentlemen, please remain calm and follow all instructions from the cabin crew. Sarah forced herself to appear frightened like the other passengers. She slumped down in her seat and let her breathing become rapid and shallow, the perfect imitation of a terrified civilian. But her mind was working at lightning speed, developing and discarding tactical plans. The hijacker leader was making his way down the aisle, looking at passengers and occasionally making threatening gestures with his weapon. Sarah could see it was some kind of improvised blade, probably ceramic or plastic to get through security. Not immediately lethal, but dangerous enough in close quarters. "You, businessman," the leader said to a passenger 3 rows ahead of Sarah. "Give me your phone. Everyone give me your phones. Put them in this bag." As the bag made its way down the aisle, Sarah quickly evaluated her options. She could probably take down the leader when he reached her row, but the other 2 hijackers would still be threats to the innocent passengers. She needed a better plan, something that would neutralize all 3 threats simultaneously without putting civilians at risk. The hijacker reached her row. "You lady in black. Phone in the bag. Now." Sarah handed over her phone with shaking hands, maintaining her frightened civilian act perfectly. "Please don't hurt anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling with apparent fear. The man looked at her with dismissive contempt. "Just stay quiet, and you won't get hurt." As he moved past her seat, Sarah noticed something crucial. His stance was wrong for someone with real combat training. These weren't professional terrorists. They were amateurs, probably desperate people with more courage than skill. That could work in her favor, but it also made them more unpredictable and potentially more dangerous to the innocent passengers. The leader reached the front of the cabin and started speaking to Jennifer in rapid, harsh tones. Sarah couldn't make out all the words, but she could see the flight attendant's face growing pale with fear. Whatever these men wanted, they were serious about it. That's when Sarah made her decision. She had sworn an oath to protect innocent people, and that oath didn't end just because she was on vacation wearing civilian clothes. These hijackers had picked the wrong plane, and they were about to discover that their biggest mistake was underestimating the quiet woman in seat 12A. Sarah began her mental preparation for combat. She regulated her breathing, centered her focus, and started planning her attack sequence. She would need to move fast, be precise, and give no warning of her capabilities until it was too late for the hijackers to react effectively. The next few minutes would determine whether 60 innocent people lived or died. Sarah Mitchell, Navy SEAL, was ready to make sure they all went home safely. She just needed to wait for the right moment to reveal that their easy target was actually their worst nightmare. The hijacker leader returned to the middle of the cabin and raised his voice again. "Listen carefully, everyone. We're going to make some changes to this flight plan. As long as everyone cooperates, no one needs to get hurt." Sarah watched and waited, every muscle coiled and ready to spring into action. The real fight was about to begin. The hijacker leader, who introduced himself only as Commander, began pacing the aisle while his 2 accomplices maintained their positions. Sarah continued her frightened passenger act while mentally cataloging every detail that might be useful in taking them down. "My name is Victor," the leader announced to the cabin. "You will do exactly what we say. We have taken control of this aircraft for a very important mission. Your government has refused to listen to our demands, so now we must take action." Jennifer Walsh tried to maintain her professional composure, but her hands were shaking as she stood near the front galley. "Sir, please, just tell us what you want. We'll cooperate fully." Victor smiled coldly. "What we want is justice. Your country has interfered in our homeland for too long. Today, we send a message that cannot be ignored." Sarah's trained ear picked up the accent, Eastern European, possibly Ukrainian or Russian. She filed this information away while continuing to study the hijackers' positioning and behavior patterns. The man at the back of the plane seemed nervous, constantly shifting his weight and checking his watch. The one in the middle was trying to look tough, but Sarah could see he was sweating despite the cool cabin temperature. These weren't hardened terrorists. They were desperate men with a cause, which made them dangerous in a different way. Desperate people made unpredictable choices, and unpredictable choices put innocent lives at risk. "You." Victor pointed at an elderly man in the front row. "What is your name?" The man's voice trembled as he answered, "Robert." Robert Johnson. Mr. Johnson, you are going to help us communicate with the authorities. We need someone they will believe, someone who sounds like a real American grandfather. Victor's smile was cruel. You will tell them exactly what we want them to hear. Sarah felt her anger building, but she forced it down. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed ice-cold calculation and perfect timing. She began running through combat scenarios in her mind, visualizing different approaches to neutralizing all three threats. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and several passengers gasped. Victor stumbled slightly, and Sarah noticed something important. His grip on the improvised weapon loosened for just a moment. Under stress, his fine motor control was deteriorating. Another useful piece of information. Everyone remained seated, Victor commanded, steadying himself against a seat. Any sudden movements, and people will get hurt. That's when Sarah heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. From the cockpit came the unmistakable noise of a struggle. Shouting, the sound of something heavy hitting the cockpit door, and then an ominous silence. Jennifer started moving toward the cockpit, but Victor grabbed her arm. Stay here. My associate is just explaining the new flight plan to your pilots. Sarah knew what that meant. The hijackers had someone in the cockpit, which meant they now controlled where the plane was going. This was no longer just a hijacking. It was a potential weapon of mass destruction in the making. She had to act soon, before they reached whatever target these men had chosen. A small child started crying in the back of the plane, and his mother tried desperately to quiet him. Shut that kid up, shouted the hijacker in the rear, moving closer to them with his weapon raised. Please, he's just scared, the mother pleaded. He's only 4 years old. Sarah watched the situation escalate, and knew she was running out of time. The hijacker near the child was losing control, his weapon hand shaking with adrenaline and nerves. In her experience, scared amateurs with weapons were more dangerous than trained professionals because they panicked and made deadly mistakes. That's when Victor made his fatal error. He moved closer to Sarah's row, turning his back to her for a moment as he shouted instructions to his accomplice near the crying child. It was the opening she had been waiting for. Sarah moved with the fluid precision of hundreds of hours of combat training. In one smooth motion, she rose from her seat, grabbed Victor's weapon hand, and twisted his arm behind his back in a move that would have made her SEAL instructors proud. Before he could even cry out, she had him in a submission hold that cut off his air supply. The hijacker in the middle section started to turn toward the commotion. Sarah was already moving. She pushed Victor's unconscious body aside and launched herself over 2 rows of seats in a movement that defied what most people thought possible for a woman in civilian clothes. The second hijacker tried to bring his weapon up, but Sarah was already inside his reach. A precise strike to his wrist made him drop the weapon. A follow-up blow to a pressure point on his neck, and he crumpled to the cabin floor, completely unconscious. The third hijacker near the back of the plane finally realized what was happening, but by then, it was too late. Sarah was already moving toward him with the deadly grace of a predator. The passengers in the back rows pressed themselves against the windows, giving her a clear path. Stay back, the third hijacker shouted, waving his weapon wildly. I'll kill them all. Sarah stopped about 10 feet away from him, her hands raised in apparent surrender. Okay, let's talk about this. You don't want to hurt innocent people. Her voice was calm, soothing, the voice of someone trying to negotiate. But her eyes were calculating distance, angle of attack, and the exact sequence of movements that would take down the third threat without endangering the nearby passengers. You're not just a passenger, the hijacker said, his eyes wide with the realization that his carefully planned operation was falling apart. Who are you? Just someone who doesn't like bullies, Sarah replied, taking a small step closer. The hijacker made his final mistake. He looked away for just a fraction of a second to check on his unconscious accomplices. In that instant, Sarah closed the distance between them. Her movements were too fast for the untrained eye to follow. One moment she was 10 feet away. The next she was behind the hijacker with his weapon in her hand and him unconscious on the floor. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. The cabin fell silent except for the crying child and the sound of the airplane engines. 60 passengers stared in shock at the woman who had just single-handedly neutralized 3 armed hijackers. Jennifer Walsh was the first to find her voice. "Ma'am, who are you?" Sarah was already moving toward the cockpit, the hijacker's weapons secured. "Right now, I'm your best chance of getting home safely. There's still at least one more of them in the cockpit with the pilots." She paused at the cockpit door and listened carefully. She could hear voices inside, at least 3 people, possibly 4. One voice was definitely the hijacker giving orders, but she couldn't tell if the pilots were injured or just being controlled. Sarah turned back to Jennifer. "I need you to make an announcement. Tell the passengers to stay in their seats and remain calm. Tell them the situation is under control. But what about the cockpit? What if?" "Leave that to me," Sarah said quietly. "I'm trained for this." As Jennifer made the announcement, Sarah examined the cockpit door. It was locked from the inside, reinforced against exactly this kind of situation. But Sarah had trained for scenarios like this. She knew the weak points, the ways to gain entry even when conventional methods failed. She could hear the 4th hijacker inside the cockpit, apparently arguing with the pilots about changing course. From what she could make out, they wanted to fly to a major city, probably planning to use the plane as a weapon against a symbolic target. Sarah made her decision. She couldn't wait for backup or ground control to figure out a solution. Every minute that passed brought them closer to whatever target the hijackers had chosen, and she couldn't allow that to happen. She positioned herself at the optimal angle to the cockpit door and prepared to implement a breach technique she had learned in advanced SEAL training. It would be loud, it would be dangerous, and it would probably terrify the passengers even more. But it was the only way to save their lives. "Jennifer," she called out to the flight attendant. "When I give the signal, I want you to tell everyone to brace for impact and cover their heads. This is going to be intense." Jennifer nodded, her face pale but determined. The passengers who could hear were looking at Sarah with a mixture of fear and hope, finally beginning to understand that this wasn't just a lucky passenger who had gotten brave. This was someone with professional training and the skills to back it up. Sarah took a deep breath and centered herself. The next few minutes would determine whether Flight 447 became a tragedy or a triumph. She had faced down terrorists, enemy soldiers, and impossible odds before. Today would be no different. The hijackers had made their choice when they decided to threaten innocent people. Now they were about to discover that their perfect plan had one fatal flaw. They had chosen the wrong flight on the wrong day. Sarah Mitchell, Navy SEAL, was about to show them the error of their ways. Sarah positioned herself outside the cockpit door and listened intently to the voices inside. Through her specialized training, she could distinguish between the hijackers' commands and the pilot's responses. Captain Mike Torres and First Officer Lisa Chun were still alive and conscious, but they were being forced to input new navigation coordinates. "Change course to Washington now," the hijacker was shouting in accented English. "You have 5 minutes, or I start killing passengers." Sarah's blood ran cold. Washington meant either the Capitol or the White House, both targets that would result in massive casualties beyond just the people on the plane. She had to act immediately. Jennifer appeared beside her, having secured the cabin as much as possible. "The passengers are secured. What's your plan?" "I need you to call the ground and tell them we have a hijacking situation under control in the cabin. But there's still one hostile in the cockpit," Sarah whispered. "Tell them not to send fighter jets yet. That will only panic the guy inside and make him do something desperate." As Jennifer moved to make the call, Sarah examined the cockpit door more carefully. The standard reinforcement was designed to keep hijackers out, but it also made rescue operations nearly impossible. However, Sarah had trained with aircraft engineers who had shown her the weak points that even the manufacturers didn't advertise. She pulled a small multi-tool from her pocket, something that looked innocent enough to pass through airport security, but was actually a precision instrument her team had designed for exactly these situations. With careful pressure at a specific point near the door frame, she could create a stress fracture that would allow the door to be forced open. Inside the cockpit, the tension was escalating. "I said change course now," the hijacker screamed. Captain Torres tried to keep his voice steady. "Sir, I need clearance from air traffic control. If I just change course without authorization, they'll send fighter jets to shoot us down. Then, get clearance. Tell them you have a medical emergency." First Officer Chin spoke up quietly. "If we don't follow proper procedures, they'll know something is wrong. Let me handle communications. I can make it sound legitimate. Sarah heard this exchange and realized the pilots were trying to buy time. They were professionals who understood the gravity of the situation. But she also knew the hijacker would lose patience soon, and desperate people did unpredictable things. She applied pressure to the precise spot on the door frame and heard the subtle sound of metal beginning to separate. Just a little more pressure, and she would be able to breach the cockpit. But timing was everything. She needed to coordinate her entry with the moment when the hijacker was most distracted. That opportunity came when Lisa Chen started her radio communication with air traffic control. Denver Control, this is United 447. We're declaring a medical emergency and requesting immediate clearance for course change to Washington Dulles. The air traffic controller's voice crackled back immediately. United 447, describe the nature of your medical emergency. As the hijacker focused intently on what the pilots were saying to ensure they didn't reveal the real situation, Sarah made her move. With one powerful push, the weakened door frame gave way and she burst into the cockpit. The hijacker spun around, his weapon raised, but Sarah was already inside his guard. Years of close-quarters combat training took over as she disarmed him with a move so fast that neither pilot fully saw what happened. One moment the hijacker was threatening them with a blade. The next he was unconscious on the cockpit floor with Sarah standing over him. Jesus Christ, Captain Torres breathed, staring at Sarah in amazement. Who the hell are you? Captain Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Navy. She replied crisply, immediately checking the instrument panels to assess the aircraft's status. We need to get this bird back on course and notify authorities that all threats have been neutralized. Lisa Chun was the first to recover from the shock. Navy? You mean your military? SEAL team, Sarah confirmed, now taking control of the communications. Denver Control, this is, actually, let me handle this properly. She took the radio headset from Lisa. Denver Control, United 447. The medical emergency has been resolved. We're requesting clearance to resume original flight path to Denver International. United 447, Roger. Are you certain the emergency is resolved? We have fighter aircraft standing by to assist. Sarah exchanged glances with Captain Torres, who nodded his approval for her to continue handling communications. Denver Control, the situation is completely under control. All passengers and crew are safe. We'll need law enforcement standing by upon arrival, but no military intervention is necessary. As the plane banked back toward its original course, Sarah helped Captain Torres and Lisa Chun secure the unconscious hijacker. The cockpit was small, but they managed to restrain him with zip ties that Sarah produced from her multi-tool kit. I have to ask, Captain Torres said as they worked, how does a Navy SEAL end up as a passenger on a commercial flight? Sarah smiled grimly. I'm on leave, visiting family. Wrong place, wrong time for them. Right place, right time for you. Lisa Chin shook her head in wonder. Those guys had no idea what they were walking into. They made a lot of mistakes, Sarah agreed. Amateur operation, probably motivated by desperation rather than professional training. They chose their target based on emotional impact rather than tactical advantage. Back in the cabin, Jennifer was trying to keep the passengers calm while they processed what had just happened. The three unconscious hijackers were secured with improvised restraints, and several male passengers had volunteered to stand guard over them. Robert Johnson, the elderly man who had been threatened earlier, stood up shakily. Excuse me, miss, he called out to Jennifer. Who was that woman? The one who saved us. Jennifer looked toward the cockpit, then back at the passengers. I don't know all the details, but she told me she's U.S. Navy. She handled this situation like she's done it 100 times before. A young businessman who had witnessed Sarah's takedown of the second hijacker spoke up. She moved like something out of an action movie. I've never seen anything like it. The mother with the crying 4-year-old managed a shaky smile. She saved my son's life. That man was going to hurt him. I could see it in his eyes. Word began to spread through the cabin that their rescuer wasn't just a brave passenger, but a trained military professional. The fear that had gripped everyone began to transform into amazement and gratitude. Sarah emerged from the cockpit and addressed the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Captain Sarah Mitchell. The situation is completely under control. All 4 hijackers have been neutralized, and are in custody. We're returning to our original flight path and should arrive in Denver on schedule." She paused, looking at the faces of people she had just saved. "I know this was terrifying, and I want you to know that your safety was my only priority. These individuals made the mistake of trying to harm innocent people, and as a member of the U.S. military, I couldn't allow that to happen." An older woman near the front raised her hand tentatively. "Captain, were you really a SEAL?" Sarah nodded. "I am. Navy SEAL, currently on leave." The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. People were crying, laughing, and trying to process the fact that they had just witnessed something that most people only see in movies. A real-life hero had been sitting quietly among them, and when danger struck, she had risen to the occasion with skill and courage that saved all their lives. Jennifer approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Captain, I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't been here." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah replied. "This is what I swore to do, protect innocent people from those who would harm them. It doesn't matter if I'm in uniform or on vacation." As the plane continued its flight to Denver, Sarah returned to her seat and tried to process what had just happened. She had been looking forward to a quiet vacation, time to decompress, and be a normal person for a while. Instead, she had found herself thrust back into the role that defined her: protector, warrior, guardian of those who couldn't protect themselves. But as she looked around at the grateful faces of her fellow passengers, many of whom were still stealing glances at her in amazement, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Pride, not just in her training or her capabilities, but in the oath she had taken and the values she represented. The hijackers had thought they were seizing a plane full of helpless civilians. They had no way of knowing that among those civilians sat one of America's most elite warriors, someone who had dedicated her life to standing between evil and innocence. Their plan had failed not because of bad luck, but because they had underestimated the courage and capability that could be found in the most unexpected places. As Denver approached on the horizon, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Her nephews were going to be very excited to hear about Aunt Sarah's interesting flight. As Flight 447 began its descent into Denver International Airport, Sarah could see the emergency vehicles already positioned on the tarmac below. Word had obviously spread quickly through official channels about what had happened in the sky above Colorado. Captain Torres came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to Denver International. As you can see, there are emergency vehicles standing by, but this is purely precautionary. Thanks to Captain Mitchell's heroic actions, we're all safe, and the situation is completely under control." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention. She had done her job, nothing more, nothing less. But she could see in the faces around her that these people viewed her actions as something extraordinary. To them, she wasn't just a soldier following her training. She was a miracle that had appeared when they needed it most. Jennifer approached her seat again. "Captain, the FBI wants to speak with you as soon as we land. They said they're sending a special agent to debrief you." "That's standard procedure," Sarah nodded. "They'll want to know everything about the hijackers' methods, their weapons, their apparent motivation. It all goes into intelligence databases to help prevent future incidents." A teenage girl sitting across the aisle leaned over. "Captain Mitchell, I'm sorry to bother you, but could I ask you something?" "Sure," Sarah replied gently. "How did you know you could take them down? Weren't you scared they might hurt other people if you fought back?" It was a thoughtful question from someone who was clearly trying to understand the split-second decisions that had saved everyone's lives. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Fear is normal," she said. "I was absolutely afraid, not for myself, but for all of you. The training teaches you to use that fear, to channel it into focus and precision. As for knowing I could stop them, I watched them for several minutes before acting. I could see they weren't professional terrorists. They were desperate amateurs who had made several tactical mistakes." The businessman who had witnessed the takedown spoke up. "What kind of mistakes?" Sarah glanced around at the interested faces. These people deserved to understand what had happened to them. They positioned themselves poorly, too spread out to support each other effectively. They chose improvised weapons that looked threatening but weren't optimal for controlling a confined space like an aircraft cabin. Most importantly, they underestimated their opposition. They saw a plane full of civilians and assumed everyone would be helpless. Robert Johnson, the elderly man who had been threatened, laughed shakily. Boy, did they get that wrong. As the plane touched down smoothly at Denver International, Sarah could see the full scope of the emergency response waiting for them. FBI vehicles, police cars, ambulances, fire trucks, and what looked like military personnel. The hijacking of a commercial aircraft was taken very seriously by every branch of law enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Torres announced, we'll be taxiing to a special gate where law enforcement will board the aircraft. Please remain seated until they give you clearance to disembark. Each of you will need to give a brief statement about what you witnessed, but this shouldn't take too long. Sarah knew the drill. Every passenger would be interviewed, the hijackers would be taken into federal custody, and the aircraft would be processed as a crime scene. She would probably spend the next several hours in detailed debriefings with FBI agents, military intelligence officers, and possibly Homeland Security officials. The plane came to a stop at the designated gate, and within minutes, FBI agents in tactical gear were boarding through the forward door. The lead agent, a serious-looking woman in her 40s, made her way directly to Sarah's seat. Captain Mitchell? I'm Special Agent Rebecca Stone, FBI. We need to speak with you immediately. Sarah stood and gathered her small carry-on. Of course. What do you need to know? Everything, Agent Stone replied. This incident is already being classified as a terrorist attempt, and your actions prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on the nation's capital. As Sarah moved toward the front of the plane, the passengers began applauding again. She turned back to address them one final time. Thank you all for your cooperation during this incident. You stayed calm under extreme pressure, and that made it possible for me to do my job effectively. Your courage helped save lives today. Robert Johnson stood up slowly, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. No, Captain. Your courage saved our lives. We'll never forget what you did for us. The applause continued as Sarah left the aircraft with Agent Stone. As they walked through the jet bridge, the FBI agent began asking detailed questions about the timeline of events, the hijackers' apparent objectives, and the specific methods Sarah had used to neutralize them. We've already run preliminary background checks on the 4 suspects, Agent Stone explained as they entered the terminal. They appeared to be Ukrainian nationals with possible connections to extremist groups upset about U.S. foreign policy. We're still determining how they got weapons past security. Sarah thought about this information. The weapons were improvised ceramic or plastic blades, designed to look like innocent objects to airport scanners. It suggests some level of planning and knowledge about security procedures. They were escorted to a secure area of the terminal where Sarah would spend the next 4 hours giving detailed statements to various agencies. FBI counterterrorism specialists wanted to know every detail about the hijackers' behavior and methods. Military intelligence officers were interested in her tactical assessment of the threats and her decision-making process during the crisis. During one of the breaks, Sarah was allowed to call her sister to explain why she might be late for dinner. Sarah? Thank God you're calling. We saw on the news that there was some kind of incident on a flight from Miami to Denver. Please tell me you weren't. I was on that flight, Lisa. But I'm fine. Everyone's fine. There was a long pause. The news said someone on the plane stopped hijackers. Sarah, was that you? Sarah looked around the secure interview room where FBI agents were reviewing her statement. Yeah, it was me. Another pause, longer this time. My sister, the hero. The boys are going to flip when they find out their Aunt Sarah saved a whole airplane. I'd rather keep this quiet if possible. You know how I feel about publicity. Too late for that, sis. You're already on every news channel in the country. CNN is calling you the guardian angel at 35,000 feet. Sarah groaned. Media attention was the last thing she wanted. All she had ever wanted was to do her job and protect people. The spotlight made her uncomfortable and could potentially compromise her ability to serve on classified missions in the future. Agent Stone returned with more questions, and Sarah ended the call with promises to see her family as soon as the debriefings were complete. Captain, we've been in contact with your commanding officers at SEAL Team Headquarters, Agent Stone said. They're very interested in your tactical assessment of this incident. Apparently, this is exactly the kind of scenario they've been training for in their anti-terrorism programs. It's not the first time I've dealt with hijackers, Sarah admitted. But this was the first time as a passenger rather than as part of a planned military operation. That makes your actions even more impressive. You had no backup, no mission briefing, no specialized equipment beyond what you could improvise. You assessed the situation, developed a plan, and executed it flawlessly under pressure. As the interviews continued, Sarah learned more about the investigation. The four hijackers were part of a larger cell that had been planning attacks on American targets for over a year. This flight had been chosen specifically because it originated in Miami, a city with large international populations where foreign nationals could blend in easily. They made one critical error in their planning, Agent Stone explained. They researched flight schedules, security procedures, and target selection very carefully. But they didn't think to check the passenger manifest. If they had known there was an active-duty Navy SEAL on board, they would have chosen a different flight. Sarah smiled grimly. Lucky for the passengers that they didn't do their homework. By evening, the formal debriefings were complete, and Sarah was finally free to leave the airport. As she walked through the terminal toward the exit where her sister was waiting, she reflected on how much her quiet vacation had changed in just a few hours. She had boarded that plane as Captain Sarah Mitchell on leave, looking forward to 2 weeks of being just another civilian. Now she was walking through an airport where news crews were still broadcasting reports about the hero SEAL who had saved Flight 447. Her sister Lisa was waiting by the pickup area, and when she saw Sarah coming, she ran over and hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you," Lisa whispered. "But I'm also terrified. What if something had gone wrong? What if they had hurt you?" Sarah hugged her sister back. But they didn't. Everyone went home safe, and that's what matters. As they drove toward Lisa's house, Sarah could see her nephews' faces pressed against the window, watching for their aunt's arrival. She realized that her vacation might be different than she had planned, but it would definitely be memorable. The hijackers had thought they were seizing control of just another commercial flight. They had no way of knowing that among the ordinary passengers sat someone extraordinary, a guardian who would never let evil triumph over innocence, no matter what the cost to herself. 3 days later, Sarah sat in her sister's backyard, watching her nephews practice the basic self-defense moves she had taught them. 8-year-old Tommy was showing 6-year-old Marcus how to break free from a grabbed wrist, their serious faces making her smile despite everything that had happened. "Aunt Sarah," Tommy called out, "when you were on that airplane, were you scared?" It was the same question the teenage passenger had asked, but, coming from her nephew, it carried different weight. Sarah wanted to give him an honest answer that would teach him something important about courage. "Yes, I was scared," she said, sitting down on the grass beside them. "But being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. Being brave means doing the right thing even when you're afraid." Marcus, the younger boy, looked at her with wide eyes. "Did the bad guys know you were a SEAL?" "Not until it was too late for them to change their plans," Sarah laughed. "They thought they were dealing with ordinary passengers. They never expected someone with military training to be on board." The boys had seen the news coverage, of course. Their Aunt Sarah was suddenly famous across the country, though she had tried her best to avoid most of the media attention. The story had everything that captured public imagination: a hidden hero, dramatic action, and innocent lives saved against impossible odds. Lisa came out of the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade and her phone. "Sarah, you've got another interview request. This one's from 60 Minutes. Sarah shook her head firmly. "Same answer as all the others. I'm not doing any more interviews." "But this could be good for the Navy, showing people what women in the military can accomplish," Lisa argued gently. "The Navy has public affairs officers whose job it is to handle media relations," Sarah replied. "My job is operational, and too much publicity makes it harder for me to do that job effectively." What Sarah didn't tell her sister was that she had already received new orders. Her commanding officer had called that morning to inform her that her leave was being cut short. The incident on Flight 447 had attracted attention from the highest levels of government, and there were new assignments waiting for her, missions that required someone with her unique combination of aviation skills and combat experience. The doorbell rang, and Lisa went inside to answer it. She returned a moment later with a man in a military uniform that Sarah immediately recognized. "Captain Mitchell," the man said, approaching with a crisp salute. "Commander William Hayes, Naval Special Warfare Command. I need to speak with you privately." Sarah stood and returned the salute. "Of course, sir." "Boys, Why don't you go inside and help your mom with lunch? When they were alone, Commander Hayes got straight to business. Captain, your actions on Flight 447 have been reviewed at the highest levels. The President himself has been briefed on what happened. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention from such high-ranking officials. Sir, I was just doing my job. That's exactly the point, Captain. You weren't on duty, you weren't in uniform, you had no backup or support, and yet you handled that situation with the same professionalism and skill that you would bring to any classified mission. That tells us something important about your character. Commander Hayes pulled out a folder from his briefcase. We have a new assignment for you, one that builds on what happened here. There's been an increase in attempts to use commercial aviation as a weapon, and we need someone who understands both the operational side of flying and the tactical side of neutralizing threats. Sarah opened the folder and scanned the briefing documents. It was exactly the kind of mission she had trained for her entire career. High stakes, critical importance, and requiring skills that only a few people in the world possessed. When do I report for duty? She asked. Monday morning, 0800 hours. But before you answer, I want you to know something. This assignment is voluntary. After what you've been through, no one would blame you if you wanted to take some time. Maybe consider a transfer to a less dangerous specialty. Sarah looked at her nephews through the kitchen window, then back at Commander Hayes. Sir, 3 days ago I saw what happens when evil people try to hurt innocent civilians. They might have succeeded if someone hadn't been there to stop them. I can't prevent every attack, but I can make sure I'm prepared for the ones I do encounter. Commander Hayes smiled. I hoped you would say that. Your country needs people like you, Captain Mitchell. People who understand that freedom isn't free, and that sometimes the price is paid by those willing to stand in the gap between darkness and light. After Commander Hayes left, Sarah spent the rest of the day with her family. They went fishing at a nearby lake, had a barbecue dinner, and played board games until the boys' bedtime. It was exactly the kind of normal, peaceful day that she had been hoping for when she first boarded Flight 447. As she tucked Tommy into bed, he looked up at her with serious eyes. Aunt Sarah, are you going to have to go fight bad guys again soon? She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. Maybe, kiddo. That's what I do. Will you be careful? I'm always careful. And I'm always thinking about you and Marcus and Mom. You guys are part of what I'm fighting to protect. The next morning, Sarah's phone rang early. It was Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant from Flight 447. Captain Mitchell? I hope I'm not calling too early. I just wanted you to know that the airline is planning to give you a special commendation ceremony. The passengers have been asking how they can thank you properly. Sarah sat up in bed, suddenly, wide awake. Jennifer, that's very kind, but I really don't need any ceremony. I know you don't need it, but we need to do it. You saved our lives. Some of those passengers have children who might not have come home if you hadn't been there. We need to be able to say thank you properly. After some discussion, Sarah agreed to a small, private gathering with the passengers and crew from Flight 447. No media, no publicity, just the people who had been there to say what needed to be said. The ceremony took place that Sunday at a hotel conference room near the airport. When Sarah arrived, she was surprised to see that nearly all of the passengers from the flight had come. Robert Johnson, the elderly man who had been threatened, stood up when she entered. Captain Mitchell, we wanted you to know that you didn't just save our lives that day. You restored our faith in what people can do when they choose to be courageous instead of looking the other way. One by one, passengers and crew members shared their thoughts. The mother with the young son spoke about how Sarah had protected her child. The teenage girl talked about how the experience had inspired her to consider military service. The businessman said he was donating money to military charities because he wanted to support the kind of training that had made Sarah's heroism possible. Captain Torres presented Sarah with a framed photograph of Flight 447, signed by everyone who had been aboard that day. This is so you'll always remember that what you did mattered, he said. But it was Jennifer Walsh who had the final word. Captain, there are people in this room who are alive today because you were willing to risk everything for strangers. You didn't know us. You didn't know us anything. But you stood up anyway. That's what real heroism looks like. As Sarah drove back to her sister's house that evening, she reflected on the events of the past week. She had started out seeking a quiet vacation, and instead found herself in a situation that tested everything she had learned and trained for throughout her military career. The hijackers had made a fatal error in choosing Flight 447. They had planned their attack carefully, researched their methods, and prepared for every contingency they could think of. But they hadn't planned for the one variable they couldn't have known about, the presence of someone who had dedicated her life to protecting others. Tomorrow she would return to duty, to new missions and new challenges. There would be other flights, other threats, other moments when good people needed someone to stand between them and those who would do them harm. Sarah Mitchell understood that being a Navy SEAL wasn't just about the uniform or the training or the classified missions. It was about the oath she had taken to defend the innocent and preserve the values that made freedom possible. The hijackers had thought they were seizing a plane full of helpless victims. Instead, they had encountered something they hadn't planned for and couldn't understand. An ordinary person who had chosen to become extraordinary through service, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. As she pulled into her sister's driveway, Sarah smiled at the thought of her nephew's reaction when she told them about the ceremony. They would be proud of their Aunt Sarah, but, more importantly, they would understand that heroes weren't just people in movies or comic books. Sometimes, heroes were people who looked just like everyone else, sitting quietly in seat 12A, ready to act when evil showed its face, and innocent people needed protection. The hijackers had learned too late that appearances could be deceiving, and that underestimating the courage of ordinary Americans was always a fatal mistake.